These lectures are part of the Great Courses series. They are produced by the Teaching Company. These lectures are titled The Early Middle Ages, Part 2. Lecture 13, Rise of the Carolingians.
Welcome back. In the last lecture, we examined the emergence of the House of Islam as Arabs, following the death of Muhammad in 632, emerged from Arabia, conquered the Persian Empire, conquered much of the Byzantine Empire, and even managed to conquer Visigothic Spain in the early 8th century. For a brief period, the Arabs had gained control of southern Francia as well in the 720s and 730s, until at the Battle of Poitiers in 732, the Frankish army defeated an Arab raiding party. A Frankish army led, not as one might have thought, by the Merovingian king of the Franks, but by a member of a Frankish aristocratic family known today as the Carolingians, although known at first as the Arnulfings. The Carolingians were going to dominate the history of the early Middle Ages, in part as a result of the prestige they gained through this victory against the Arabs. And so today we're going to examine the early history of the Carolingian family and their rise to prominence in European politics. Clovis and his descendants in the Merovingian dynasty had made the Franks the most powerful barbarian group in Europe in the 6th century, able to defeat the Goths, for example, and push them south of the Pyrenees Mountains. However, there was a fatal flaw in the Merovingian kingdom of the Franks, and that involved the issue of succession. The later Roman Empire also had a problem with succession in that there was no single clear principle of succession. The problem in Merovingian Francia was somewhat different. There was a clear principle of succession, but it actually worked against Merovingian control. Merovingian kings regarded their kingdoms as part of their personal patrimony, something that they could divide up among their heirs when one of them died. And so when Clovis dies, he will divide up the kingdom of the Franks among his sons. They will inevitably fight with one another in an attempt to gain control of all the lands that had once belonged to their father. And as a result, the political history of Merovingian Francia is a bewildering kaleidoscope of different kingdoms coming into existence, being absorbed again into a single kingdom. At any given time, there were often three major kingdoms in existence, known as Neustria, which is where the Merovingians themselves came from, Austrasia, which was further to the east of Neustria, located on the Rhine River Valley, and Burgundy in central France. The warfare among various members of the Merovingian family, as they sought to consolidate the various kingdoms into one, was very bad for Merovingian power for a number of reasons. When Merovingians went to war with one another to reclaim what had once belonged to their father, they had to bid for the support of important aristocratic families who would withhold their support until they were cut a sweet deal, usually in the form of lands, for example, or money. And the Carolingians are one of those Frankish aristocratic families that are able to enrich themselves at the expense of the Merovingians because of this Merovingian propensity for civil war. When the Merovingian rulers of Austrasia and Neustria and Burgundy were fighting against one another, they were not making conquests at the expense of their neighbors and adding to their own wealth. And as a result, the Merovingian dynasty starts to experience a serious impoverishment as the 6th century progresses. And the last Merovingian ruler, who's regarded as having exercised real authority within the Frankish lands, is a figure known as Dagobert, who ruled from 625 to 638. Between the 630s and the 660s, matters grew even worse for the Merovingians because of bad dynastic luck. It just so happened that during these decades, the Merovingian kingdoms experienced a series of royal minorities, which is to say a series of periods in which the ruling king was a child under the age of 12, which is the age at which you are able to rule in your own name. And periods of minority were very bad for ruling dynasties. because it was fairly easy for aristocratic families such as the Carolingian family to cajole these young rulers into making concessions that they ought not to have made. In return for a lollipop or sweets, you would be granted a major estate or an important monastery or the right to collect taxes in a certain region. And Frankish aristocratic families exploited this series of royal minorities to weaken Merovingian control still more. The actual running of the Frankish government during the period of minorities from the 630s to the 660s fell into the hands of important government officials known as the mayors of the palace. And this is the case in all of the various Frankish kingdoms. The mayor of the palace was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the Frankish government. He oversees the Frankish bureaucracy. The mayor of the palace controls access to Merovingian rulers as well, determines who gets to see the Merovingian king or not see the Merovingian king, and really determines the agenda for the whole of the Frankish government. Perhaps even more importantly, the mayor of the palace controls the appointments to various important offices within the Frankish kingdoms. The mayor of the palace decides who gets to be count, for example, if the last count dies, who gets to be duke, which is an even higher office than count, decides who gets to be abbot of an important monastery when the last abbot dies, decides who gets to be bishop. If you have the power to control these appointments, then you have the ability to fill the Frankish church and the Frankish government with your own supporters, rewarding them. And the loyalty of those whom you appoint will often be directed towards you rather than towards the Merovingian king. The Carolingians are mayors of the palace in Austrasia, and they exploit their position as mayors of the palace to build up a power base within this region. However, in other Frankish kingdoms, other aristocratic families were doing the same thing. Mayors of the palace in Neustria, for example, are putting together their own power base. And the Carolingians, if they wanted to gain control of these other Frankish territories, were going to have to do battle with their rival mayors of the palace. The most important battle fought between the Carolingian mayors of the palace and their rivals in Neustria came in 687 at the Battle of Tertry, where a Carolingian mayor of the palace by the name of Pepin II, sometimes called Pippin II, defeated the Neustrian mayor of the palace named Berkar, and as a result, the Carolingians were able to extend their control over Neustria as well as Austrasia. At first, Pepin II was content to appoint puppets who answered to him as mayors of the palace in Neustria, but towards the end of his life, and he dies in 714, he assumed the title of mayor of the palace in Neustria for himself. Later generations would look back on the Carolingian period as a period of remarkable unity, because the Carolingians were going to create an empire that encompassed much of the European continent and even encompassed territories that the Romans themselves had never succeeded in conquering. In a sense, though, this is a very romanticized view of the Carolingian world because there was a great deal of resentment against the Carolingians, even against the most famous of them, Charlemagne, because the Carolingians were really an upstart aristocratic family that began on a level similar to many other Frankish aristocratic families, and their attempts to elevate themselves to a position of superiority vis-a-vis other Frankish aristocrats was not appreciated by other aristocratic families, who often looked for any opportunity to try and undermine the Carolingians and their rise to power. When Pepin II died in 714, the Carolingian control that he had established over Neustria and over Austrasia nearly fell apart as a result of the resistance of other Frankish aristocrats. Pepin II had no legitimate male sons when he died, and so he announced that his successor should be an illegitimate infant grandchild of his, and that his surviving wife, whose name was Plectrudis, should look after the interests of this illegitimate infant grandchild, Theodoald. Now, an illegitimate child's claim to be a successor was going to be dubious under any circumstances. When the illegitimate youth is actually a grandchild rather than an actual child, there was not a lot of support for Theudwald or for Plectrudis. And Neustria seized this opportunity to revolt against the Carolingians and to try and create a Neustrian mayor of the palace for themselves. There were many Carolingian supporters, people who had been rewarded by Pepin II, who were fearful that they were going to lose their positions as a result of this turn of events. And an illegitimate son of Pepin II, by the name of Charles Martel, was going to exploit this fear to rally Carolingian supporters around himself rather than around Theudwald and Plectrudis. Charles Martel claimed that while, yes, he was illegitimate, well, he's no different from Theudwald, and more importantly, he's an adult, and Theudwald is an infant, and therefore Charles Martel can defend Carolingian interests better and can maintain Carolingian control over Neustria. Plectrudis did not appreciate the fact that Charles Martel is now posing as the true successor of Pepin II, and she imprisons Charles Martel for a period, but he escapes from prison, and from 714 to 719 fights a two-front war against, on the one hand, Plectrudis and Theudwald and those who tried to follow Pepin II's wishes, and on the other hand, against the Neustrians who were trying to break away from the control of the Austrasians. Charles Martel prevailed in this war, and as a result becomes mayor of the Palace of Austrasia himself. In order not to offend the Neustrians, whom he had defeated, he did not take the title of mayor of the Palace of Neustria for himself, but instead installed various puppets there who answered to him. Once the bastard Charles Martel, and I use the term in a technical sense, not as a description of his personality, he's illegitimate. Once he had secured his position, he launched the Franks on a series of wars of aggression against their neighbors in an attempt to prove that he was in fact worthy of the position he had won. Following his victory at Poitiers against the Arabs in 732, he launches a series of annual raids into the south of Francia, where he manages to push the Arabs back across the Pyrenees Mountains. And by roughly 739, he had managed to regain control of southern Francia and reintegrated it into the Merovingian kingdom. It should be noted, however, that while the inhabitants of southern Francia had not welcomed the Arabs, they did not welcome Charles Martel either, and often fought against him in an attempt to maintain their independence from the north of Francia. Even as Charles Martel was expanding Carolingian control over Neustria and even over southern Francia, important developments were occurring far away in the Byzantine Empire that were going to play an important role in the rise of the Carolingian dynasty in Europe. Ever since the days of Constantine, secular rulers had maintained strict control over the church. We saw how Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea and ruled against Arianism. Other emperors after him did the same thing. And this control over the church took the form not just of convening church councils, sitting in on the sessions, and then making the final determination on matters of theology. One of the most important forms of control that secular rulers had was control over papal election and consecration, which allows secular rulers to determine, in essence, who the next pope is going to be. The choosing of a pope after the last pope had died involved two separate processes. There had to be an election, and then there had to be a consecration. How papal elections took place in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages is very mysterious. Theoretically, the whole population of Rome and all the clergy in Rome were supposed to get together and choose the pope. In practice, this seems not to have happened, and instead, leading families of the city of Rome would get together and try and decide among themselves who the next pope should be. In a sense, though, election was meaningless. Once you had been elected pope, you are not actually pope. Not until you have undergone consecration can you exercise the office of Pope. And consecration was carried out by Italian bishops. There are 4 who are charged with this responsibility. Around 550, or in other words, during the period when the Byzantines are wresting control of Rome from the Ostrogoths, it appears that Byzantine emperors assumed a power that had been held by local secular authorities in Italy before them, the right to veto consecrations. The way it worked was that after election, the Pope would have to notify either the Byzantine emperor or a Byzantine official in Italy known as the Exarch of Ravenna that you had been elected as Pope. And then you had to await approval from either a Byzantine official or from the emperor himself before you undergo consecration. If the Exarch doesn't want you to be Pope, or if the emperor doesn't want you to be Pope, then you're not supposed to be consecrated, and whoever elected you has to go back to the drawing board and pick someone else. Byzantine emperors regarded the right to veto consecrations and to be notified after an election as a prerogative that they had to guard quite jealously because it allowed them to control the head of the Christian church. And when popes failed to follow proper procedure and tried to have themselves consecrated without telling the Byzantine emperors were very unhappy about this matter. Take, the hapless Martin I, for example. Pope Martin I had himself consecrated as Pope in 649 without getting imperial approval. The emperor ordered the arrest of the Pope by Byzantine officials, who was then dragged to Constantinople, placed on trial for having dared to accept consecration without imperial approval, found guilty, deposed, and sentenced to death. The emperor, in an act of mercy, commuted the death sentence to lifetime exile in rather uncomfortable circumstances. But the fact that the emperor could do this to a pope shows that they were not going to tolerate popes who attempted to assume office without getting imperial approval first. The papacy, for its part, was willing to accept Byzantine overlordship and Byzantine control of elections because they expected something from Byzantine emperors in return for accepting this control. They expected protection. And the people from whom popes wanted to be protected were the Lombards. The Lombards, we might recall, had swept into northern Italy in 568 and captured it. They are the neighbors of the popes. And popes always regarded the Lombards, with good reason, as a threat to papal property in Italy. The Lombards, in fact, did attack papal property in an attempt to steal it for themselves. Popes wanted Byzantine emperors to protect them from the Lombards because there are no papal states at this period. There is no independent papal army. The papacy has to rely on the Byzantines for this protection. From the Byzantine point of view, however, protecting papal property in the 7th and early 8th centuries was a matter of relatively low importance. They had bigger problems on their hands. They had the Slavs, and they had the Persians, and most notably the Arabs. In fact, they were fighting for their own survival. And as a result, Byzantine protection for the papacy was not always as forthcoming as popes would have liked. Still, popes remained loyal to the Byzantine Empire for a remarkably long period of time, long indeed after the Byzantines had stopped protecting the papacy to any appreciable degree. It's worth noting that between 678 and 752, 11 out of 13 popes were either Greek or Syrian in their background, which is to say they come from the Byzantine part of the world. In 663, the Byzantine emperor visits Rome and is received by the Pope and by the inhabitants of Rome as the lawful ruler of Rome. In 710, the Pope visits Constantinople and is received with every mark of reverence by the Byzantine emperor. No one knew it at the time, but the visit of the Byzantine emperor to Rome in 663 is the last such visit by a Byzantine emperor to Rome until the 14th century. No pope has visited Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's known today, since 710. And the reason for this is the iconoclasm controversy, which breaks out between the papacy and the Byzantine Empire in the 710s and the 720s. In 717 and 718, the Byzantine emperor by the name of Leo III is attempting to keep the Byzantine Empire in existence against yet another Arab attempt to capture Constantinople. And he raises the tax burden on the Byzantine Empire still higher in an attempt to fund an even larger army to save Constantinople. The papacy had tax obligations to the Byzantine Empire. They pay taxes. But because Byzantine emperors had not been showing much interest in protecting papal property from the Lombards, the papacy stages a tax revolt and refuses to contribute to these tax payments, and as a result, relations between the papacy and Leo III grow very tense. They grow even worse when, around 725, Leo III forbids the veneration of religious images in the Byzantine Empire and institutes a policy of iconoclasm. Religious images or icons, pictures of saints, for example, or pictures of Jesus of Nazareth, pictures of the Virgin Mary, these had played a very important role in Byzantine religion. People often had these pictures hanging in their homes, and they would pray to them. Leo III ordered these images to be destroyed in homes and in churches. And around 729, he sends a letter to the Pope saying, I expect you to carry out this policy of iconoclasm in the churches that are under your jurisdiction as well. For an emperor to tell the Pope about a matter of theology or liturgy is nothing new. What is surprising is the fact that the Pope refused and said he would not destroy religious images. In retaliation, around 732 or 733, the Byzantine emperor seized all papal property in southern Italy and Sicily, which are still Byzantine territories at this point, and he transfers the jurisdiction of the churches in these areas to the chief religious official in Constantinople, known as the Patriarch of Constantinople. This was a severe blow to the papacy, losing control of these churches, but the papacy had a way to retaliate itself. In the middle of the 8th century, the papacy stopped the practice of seeking Byzantine approval of papal consecrations. They stopped notifying emperors about who had been elected pope and, in essence, declares independence from the Byzantine Empire. The ethnic origins of popes from the middle of the 8th century onwards reflects the abruptness of the shift. From 752 onward, no one of Greek origin is elected as pope until the 15th century. Popes are going to be Westerners from Italy, Germany, or France more often from now on. It should be noted that the papal defiance of Byzantine emperors is a political act rather than a religious act. You have not yet reached the point of religious schism as the Byzantine Empire becomes orthodox and breaks away from Western Catholicism. The great schism between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches will not occur until the 11th century. This is an act of political liberation on the part of the papacy, where they won't accept the Byzantine emperors as their overlords. But this split over the policy of iconoclasm will certainly lay the foundations for the later break of Christianity into Orthodox and Catholic camps. As for why Emperor Leo III ordered a policy of iconoclasm, it was an attempt to deal with the Arab attacks. Byzantines wondered why it was that the Arabs were so successful against everyone. They weren't willing to acknowledge that Islam is superior to Christianity, but clearly the Arabs are onto something and doing something right because God seems to be on their side. Islam was hostile towards religious images. In fact, may not have permitted any religious images at all in Muslim worship. And it would appear that Leo III tried to steal the thunder of the Arabs by borrowing iconoclasm from the Arabs and hoping that that the veneration of religious images was what was disturbing God, and that the policy of iconoclasm would allow the Byzantines to triumph over the Arabs. If you can't beat them, destroy images like them. The papacy's revolt against the Byzantine Empire left the papacy vulnerable. Who's going to protect the papacy from the Lombards now? Who would be willing to do so? the Carolingians would be willing to do so. Charles Martel died in 741, and he left behind two sons, one named Carloman, who would retire to a monastery in 747, and another, a figure of great importance in Carolingian history, named Pepin III, or Pepin the Short, who would not die until 768. The death of Charles Martel was almost a replay of the death of Pepin II. There are revolts against the Carolingians that need to be put down, but Pepin the Short succeeds in reimposing Carolingian control over Neustria, and he spends much of the 760s traveling to the south of Francia and consolidating Carolingian control there. But Pepin the Short was going to be important not so much because he manages to maintain the status quo that Charles Martel had established. He's important because he took the Carolingian dynasty into some new directions, and indeed he was going to depose the last Merovingian king of the Franks. In 750, Pepin the Short sent ambassadors to Rome, to the Pope, and asked the Pope whether it was right for the Merovingians to remain king of the Franks, because they hadn't been doing anything for a long time. The Carolingians had been running the Frankish government. We were the ones who won the Battle of Poitiers. Shouldn't we hold not just the substance of power, but the royal title as well? Papacy decided to accede to this request and gave the Carolingians permission to depose the Merovingian dynasty. Carolingians sent the last Merovingian king into retirement in a monastery in 751, and this alliance that is formed between the papacy and the Carolingians is cemented in 754 when a pope travels north of the Alps to anoint Pepin the Short as king of the Franks and to give his approval to what had taken place. It is worth noting that the voyage of the Pope north of the Alps in 754 is the first time that any Pope had ever traveled north of the Alps, and this represents a certain shift in the papacy's mental world as it is starting to pay less attention to the eastern end of the Mediterranean and more to northern continental Europe. The papacy did not agree to the coup d'etat out of mere disinterest. There was a deal cut. In return for legitimating the overthrow of the Merovingian dynasty, an overthrow whose only justification was really the fact that the Pope had said it was okay, the Carolingians were going to have to perform certain favors for the papacy. They're going to have to assume protection of the papacy from the Lombards. And in 755 and 756, Pepin the Short leads the Frankish army south of the Alps to attack the Lombards, who had indeed been stealing papal property. Interestingly, there appears to have been a great deal of resistance among Frankish aristocrats to this intervention south of the Alps. There was no real tradition of Franks traveling to Italy and meddling in Italian affairs. But Pepin the Short browbeat Frankish aristocrats into participating in these expeditions, and he was successful in his attacks against the Lombards in 755 and 756. He forces the Lombards to return to the papacy the property they had taken from the papacy. And the deal that has been struck between the Carolingians and the papacy is working out well for all parties involved. The expeditions of the Franks south of the Alps in 755 and 756 represent as much of a turning point in early medieval history as the voyage of the Pope north of the Alps in 754. There is a long history of peoples from the Mediterranean traveling to northern continental Europe and imposing their will there. That is what the Romans had done. But now, the inhabitants of northern continental Europe are starting to travel to the Mediterranean and impose their will, and this shifting of the political center of gravity in Europe northward towards what is today northern France and northwestern Germany indicates that we are starting to take some very large steps out of the ancient world and into the Middle Ages. In conclusion, during the late 7th century and the first half of the 8th century, the Merovingian dynasty finds itself pushed aside by the Carolingian family, a process that culminates in the deposing of the last Merovingian ruler of the Franks in 751. The Carolingians are able to make themselves the kings of the Franks, in part because of the prestige they gained through their victory at the Battle of Poitiers against the Arabs, in part because they were able to come to an arrangement with the papacy, which the papacy legitimated the overthrow of the Merovingians in return for protection by the Carolingian family. As a result of this deal, the Carolingians find themselves beginning to intervene in Italian matters in the 750s, and this intervention and this tight relationship between the Carolingians and the papacy is going to continue for many decades to come. Having examined some of the lesser-known members of the Carolingian dynasty, such as Pepin II and Charles Martel and Pepin the Short, it's time to examine the most famous member of the Carolingian dynasty, Charlemagne.